Hello and welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name is Adam. I'm your host. I am the founder and the president of LifePoint Resources. That's a ministry designed to help you be with Jesus as you are becoming more and more a person of love. That's why this podcast is so important. We're having conversations to help you be with Jesus in a meaningful, listening, contemplative, and reflective way. Our guest today is Dr. Ann van der Merwe. But before we hear from her, a big shout out to some people in my life who I really, really love. This weekend, we're going to go out and see our second oldest son as he graduates with his PhD in psychology. We couldn't be more happy. I'm a really proud dad, and I'm a really happy and proud grandpa. Our oldest son and his wife just had their third child. It's a boy. And wow, we have a grandson in the house. Well, not in the house, but in the family. But hey, this isn't about me. It's about you. It's about your formational journey with God. So why don't we just get right into the conversation, shall we? Hey, everybody. I'm really thrilled to have on our show today Dr. Ann van der Merwe. She has a PhD in musicology. She told me I could just say music because that might be, a little bit easier entrance point. But I want to say musicology because that is what it is. And so Ann is, for the next hour, our resident music expert. Ann, welcome.
Thank you, Adam. It is a delight and pleasure to be here. I always enjoy chatting with you, and I enjoy the podcast, and I am really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you for sharing my enthusiasm, both for the podcast and this subject.
Absolutely. 100%.
We talk a lot on the Being Formed podcast about, spiritual practices as a way of cooperating with the work God is doing in our lives to make us the kind of people, I like to use the language, to become people of love, right? So God is actively forming and shaping us to become more and more people of love. And there's a lot of practices that we can do to support that direction that God has working in our lives. And so as we get started in this conversation, we want to think of listening, just this idea of listening as a spiritual practice.
I think that it's a way I've come to look at it, as being able to listen to music, to spoken word, as a practice in the same way as traditional things that we put in that category, things like prayer or rest, solitude, all of those things. And there have been several things that have contributed to how I've developed that view. One is that I've been exposed to some other people discussing non-traditional things as spiritual practices. So that has kind of opened my mind to that idea. And then I've just experienced for myself a new way of realizing how often listening and hearing have played a role in my own spiritual formation throughout my life. And so it's sort of giving a name to something that I have already experienced in a number of different ways and at different times in my life, that now it's like, oh, that's what God's doing and that's what I'm doing. And by naming it, it helps with what you were describing as the intentionality, is to say not just this general realization that God can work through anything in our lives and use anything to shape us and form us, but rather that we can tune in to some of those specific ways so that we can be able to notice it more easily, to engage in it more regularly, and having an intentional way to open ourselves up to what God wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the end, you guys. All right. But now we got to go to the starting point. And we want to catch people up on why we decided, let's dive into this topic. Okay. So I'll let you tell them about you reaching out to me a while back about a certain excitement we both shared.
Yes. So I saw you had shared on Facebook that you had the opportunity to go hear U2 at the Sphere in Las Vegas.
Yes.
And even though we had known each other for several years prior to that, somehow we had never landed on the fact that we were both U2 fans.
Right.
So I was immediately intrigued, not surprised, but intrigued. And I was like, oh, we've got to have some conversations about that concert and that experience and just U2's music in general and our own respective relationships with it. And what came out of that conversation that we did end up having was I really brought to the table the discovery of their latest album, The Songs of Surrender, which was also kind of an outgrowth of Bono's memoir and the whole tour experience for them at the time. But the stripping down of a lot of songs in that album and in that process really highlighted some things for me. And listening to that album was a different experience than listening to some of the earlier versions of those same songs. They were still the same songs for the most part. There were also some new lyrics and some very interesting and provocative changes that were made to both music and lyrics. And so it really tuned me into listening very closely, which is something that I've been trained to do. So it's not weird or unusual for me to do that. But it also, in this case, carried a lot of spiritual weight. It wasn't just, oh, that's an interesting musical technique, or hey, I noticed that this one's different than that. It wasn't just that typical analysis, but rather there was some spiritual weight to the decisions and changes that I saw these artists making. And that was really powerful and really intriguing and interesting. And we had the opportunity to talk about that together. And I think you resonated with that, some of those thoughts that I had as well.
I did. And I just geeked out just talking to you about those things, And I mean, when you have a PhD in musicology and you want to talk about, just basic ideas about why does something move you and why doesn't it move you, and why particularly what is it about, our shared love of U2, but also our realizing that in listening to these songs differently, different ways of listening to them, we were noticing things. We were noticing lyrics. We were noticing landing, the power of lyrics that kind of just flew by before that landed differently, right? So hopefully this conversation won't just feel to the outsider like, oh, just a couple of people geeking out. We really want to draw you all into this practice of active listening, but we want to give you a framework of why we even found our way into this conversation. And I want to back up a bit from that and talk about how you found your way into being, what you just described as someone who's been learning how to listen for a long time, especially to music. So tell us a bit of your story and catch us up to where you are today and the kind of role you're filling in the academic world as someone who helps others appreciate music.
Yeah, so musicology as a field is essentially the study of music, right? You put the ology at the end of anything and you're studying it. And in particular, it focuses on the study of the history of music. So music and its connection to its time and place. Why does music sound a certain way? And how does it reflect the culture, the time, the values, all of that? So that's the focus of that degree program and that area of study. If that sounds really obscure or weird, if you ever read popular articles on music, there's touchstones of musicology in there. If you're reading anything that's other than just this concert happened here and this happened, but it's anything goes deeper. If there's anything said about the music, anything that's noteworthy about its time, what it's reflecting, cultural values, and so forth, some of those ideas are embedded in that. And so the PhD musicologists are just people who dive really deep into that and sit in it. And as you said, nerd out about all of it. When I was in graduate school studying musicology, I learned about music in all different kinds of times and places. There's a lot of subfields that I had exposure to and interest in, because a lot of my interests also were what you might think of as crossover genres. I did a graduate minor in theater. So I had some touch points there. I've been a dancer my whole life. And so I continued to use a lot of that rhythm and cadence. It stands out a lot to me whenever I listen to any kind of music. So my listening experience is very broad, and the training of tuning in then was an extension of my own musical training as a singer and as a musician generally, into really then, what do these technical aspects of the music tell you about what people are trying to communicate about themselves, about the world? And certainly in the case of more artists than you might think, I think, what are they trying to communicate about God? What are they trying to say about their experiences of God, their doubts about God, their view of the world? These are things that are naturally embedded in that. And even in music that is not identified or categorized as Christian, there are often things that find their way in there, either things that are questioning from either an atheist point of view or from a different religious worldview, but you can see questions that line up and touch on spiritual things, questions that are being asked. And it's just the more you open yourself to notice those things, the more the music starts to make sense as a form of communication and a tool for understanding.
Understanding also how we react to it or what it evokes in us, right? Yeah.
Yes,
so why
absolutely.
is that particular genre, or that could be anything? It could be a rhythm, it could be a tone of voice, it could be a high voice, a low voice, obviously the lyrics, so many things. Why does that evoke what it evokes in us? So that's broad. Can you give us just a little example? Like, what comes to your mind when you're thinking of, like, maybe even modern artists? We talked a little bit about you too. You could use that as an example. But like, when you're listening to something and you're noticing something, what's an example of that?
Yeah, so one example that comes immediately to mind, because you mentioned U2, their song "Every Breaking Wave" has a figure, a musical figure that is beneath the lyrics, beneath the main melody that you hear, that on a very base level, if you listen to it, sounds like a wave. There's a repetitive nature to it, kind of even an undulating feel that is there, that is communicating the idea of the continualness. And then if you match that with the lyrics to the song, which are embedded in our own ability, our inability to kind of avoid the same patterns in our lives, that we keep chasing after the same things instead of just the metaphor. And the metaphor in the lyrics is, instead of like chasing after every breaking wave, if we would just relax and let ourselves float, we would have a very different and a much easier experience. So you can sort of obviously make a spiritual scriptural parallel there to to many different passages that talk about the importance of rest and trust and letting God handle things. But musically speaking, that communication, and this is on the remake of the song on the latest album, on the Songs of Surrender, that undulating pattern stands out more because the whole soundscape of the song is less. There's a lot less going on overall, so you can hear that more prominently, as well as hearing the lyrics themselves more prominently. And so all of that stands out even more strongly than it does in the original, which still has the same message, if you will. But so if you compare the two, it's a good example of how that idea of listening closely and tuning into that and hearing what's being communicated, not only in the words themselves, but in how the words are being sung and in how they're being echoed, if you will, by the instruments. that's maybe a clear, hopefully accessible example for people to
Totally. That is
notice and think
accessible.
about.
Yeah. So tell us before we move on, like how are you using this knowledge, this expertise, this love that God has given you in your life these days?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have started doing is curating playlists. And I really, really have, I do it probably with way more intentionality than the average person. Most people will just throw some things that they like together, or maybe that are, driven by a particular task and the mood you need for that task, right? You're going to put together a workout playlist. So you put on a bunch of things that are fast paced and energizing, or you want something that's a relax, right? You want something to play while you're, chilling at the end of the day. But for me, the inspiration has been more to take themes like what I just talked about in Every Breaking Wave, a theme of, human struggle, and noticing a common theme that occurs in different songs and putting those songs together driven by that theme, and in particular themes that are specifically spiritual in nature and even related to some spiritual practices. I mentioned rest. So I've compiled a list of songs that the lyrics talk about rest. The music is intentionally restful, but I would say goes a little bit deeper than just being that end of the day chill soundtrack, but rather one that, as I listen closely to the words, to the music, and to the sequence of ideas within them, what am I really being invited into? It's not just, I need to take a breath and relax, but rather I need to fully rest in the hands of God. I need to turn my life and everything I am over to Him. I need to lay down on that water and just let Him carry me. And so it's through those kinds of pairings and sequencing that I'm sort of carving out my own way of walking through that journey and of meditating on the scriptures that inspire it and returning to that theme. And part of the reason that this is so useful to me right now, I am a mom of 2 kids who are busy, like many of your listeners, I'm sure.
Mhm.
So I spend a fair amount of time driving in the car. And while I don't necessarily do this when they're in the car with me because we're having conversations or they want to listen to something else, I still have a fair amount of time when that is a place where engaging in this activity as a spiritual practice fits into my daily routine. And it's a very meaningful way to have that closeness without having to maybe carve out some of those times and spaces that maybe some of your listeners may be thinking, this is so hard for me to do, right? Because I have this going on and because this is where I am in my life and this is what my job looks like. And I can't take that. I can't go and sit out on a beach or go for a walk in the woods, and that you can create that kind of experience for yourself anywhere. It's just about being with God. That's nothing to say that those other experiences aren't great too. But that practice for me has become really meaningful, both of making the lists, because it engages my brain in the process of connecting these songs and these themes and really noticing, as well as then just being able to soak it in again and again and again and have that kind of repetition.
You have shared a couple playlists with us, and I noticed that they've got themes. Yeah, you've named them. One is called Rest, and one is called How Long. And we're going to share those. Thank you for letting us share these. We're going to share them on actually probably on our podcast notes page there, and give people a chance to experience a couple examples of playlists that you have in mind as you're thinking about this. So thank you for being generous and being willing to share these with us. And I appreciate even just the descriptions that you've added to what is rest? Why are you noticing rest as something important, and how long kind of focusing on ways of understanding our need to lament, right?
Yeah.
And how long is a lamenting kind of a question, God? So how long will we need to be in this place of grief or pain or impatience or frustration or even longing for the kingdom? And yeah, I love that you have included these for our listeners. Thank you so much.
Of course, that's the fun part, pulling it all together. And one of the things I also love, just as a side note, of encouragement to any listener who might not only want to check out these lists, but to start making their own, is the wonderful thing about modern technology is that these lists can be very fluid. This is not the era where you and I grew up, where we had to do mixtapes, and then once they were done, and you would have to make another one. So it's very easy to add and delete and rearrange. You encounter a new song that really fits in with a theme, add to it. Don't look at these as some sort of prescription from me to this is what you should listen to. Take it as a starting point and a place for you to engage with your own tastes, your own creativity, artists that you're drawn to that you think are touching on these themes, and weave them into it. If there's a song on here that you're like, this one doesn't hit for me, take it off. That's okay. That is more than okay, in fact, because the idea here is opening ourselves up to how God can speak to us through this practice. And that's why it's been so meaningful to me, as it's led me to discover some new artists, some new songs, as I search for music that is on this theme. And as I'm able to hear his voice coming through the voices of the singers and the musicians themselves, it's a really powerful process.
Well, let's jump into why the process is so powerful. So we've already used the language of active listening. When we say active, we're not talking about passive. When I think of passive listening, it reminds me of what we would call elevator music. There's this kind of soundtrack out there in our lives that's meant to just do nothing. It's meant to just, like, if we're in the elevator, it's there. We're not supposed to really pay attention to it. We might notice, hey, that's that one song, but oh, what have they done to it? They've stripped it of all of its life. So I don't know. That's just my thought, and I'll let you take it from there. But what are we talking about when we talk about active versus passive listening?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that are worth noting. One is that, as I just said, we have a lot of technology available to us today to make listening possible that has not historically been the case. And that's a wonderful thing. The downside is that because it's so accessible, we do tend to tune it out a lot of the times. You ask me about, my role now in teaching people to think about the music that they're listening to. And this is, again, something that I have done for many years. I took a pause button and had kids and stepped into ministry work. And now I'm back in the academic world doing this again. And what is sometimes the biggest hurdle is just that initial step of even saying, oh, I have to pay attention in a way that most people don't necessarily do. They hear music, they hear it going on, they know what they like and what they don't like and what appeals to them and what speaks to them. But it isn't maybe until they have that song that they really like, the song that really speaks to them, that then they tune in really closely to it. And so I think it's twofold. It's one, just a recognition that music works in this way and is meant to be something that we pay attention to instead of just the soundscape in the background of our lives. And then it's, what am I being drawn to and why? Why am I being drawn to this singer, this songwriter, this particular piece of music? What is it about that that's how we get to those musicology kinds of conversations, and how we get to the place where music becomes something that we receive. One of the things that I think is true of active listening versus passive listening is it's a posture of receptivity. It's saying, I want to receive what this artist is sharing with me. And because of that, we're honoring that person. There's something deeply meaningful about paying attention, just as we would say if you're having a conversation with someone, but they're kind of off in another world and not paying attention to what you're saying, you don't feel particularly honored in that moment, right? Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's not meant to be a judgment, because that happens to all of us at some point or another. We get distracted by something. But the truth that exists in that interpersonal dynamic is the same as when we're listening to someone who is singing to us, even if it's through a speaker on our computer or our car or our iPhone or whatever. So I think there's a posture of saying, I'm here and I want to listen and I want to hear what you have to tell me, that is coming to the table with active listening. Does that mean you can't be doing anything else at the same time? No, I already mentioned that I do this while I'm driving a car. But what it does mean is that it's going to hold more of my attention than something else, right? So the things that I would be doing while I am actively listening are things that I can do without needing to fully engage my whole brain and my whole person in them. So I'm paying attention to that. And I kind of wrote this down as I was thinking about this conversation. I think there's something about the posture too that has a similarity to the practice of silence and solitude, which is a very common rhythm of spiritual formation and a spiritual practice, because we are intentionally putting ourselves in a situation where we can hear from God, where we can hear things. And while this is a little bit different, obviously we are inviting God to speak to us through other people. There is that same level of intentionality of saying, I want to be open to hearing this. I want to attend to it and pay attention to it and notice what's there and focus my attention on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. And so there's a posture then we need to understand when we're talking about active listening. And I like how you've just made the kind of the shift a bit away from this conversation about simply music and music only. There is a posture in that, and there's a posture in really tuning into listening, paying attention to being available to God speaking to us and to others, right? And there's active listening, ways we can learn how to be active listeners when we're communicating with people, right? And people actually can take classes on this. Like, okay, ask more questions, right? Be more interested in them. Say less, right? So but there's a posture even underneath the technique that we need to understand. It's a posture of our own soul. And I'd love
Right.
for you to just unpack that for us.
Yeah, I think the posture comes, if you think about the techniques, right? The techniques in the personal communication are the things that you were just talking about. The techniques in music are that I'm going to pay attention and listen for this and listen for that and notice these things. The posture is what you're bringing to the table to say, I'm interested and invested enough to want to do that.
Yes.
And I see the value in it, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's I think if we use music as a focal point, but as you said, the same applies to if we're listening to someone reading poetry, or we're listening to the spoken word, we're listening to an audiobook, right? Or any of those other kinds of things that we might listen to, and just be using our ears as opposed to our other senses, right? The posture that we need in order to do that well is to say, I want to be able to hear and notice. This is what I want to be able to do. So it's that kind of step forward that recognizes this is valuable and meaningful and an opportunity, right? As opposed to thinking of it as something that might or might not yield any particular result. There's a need to presume that regardless of what I hear, that the process of going through it is useful to me.
Oh, say more about that.
Yeah, as I think about the listening to another person, right? We think about when someone is truly listening to us, oftentimes as the listener, we may think, what do I need to say in response? What do I need to do in response? But what that person often wants the most is the act of listening itself, right? Because the person ultimately wants to be heard. I want you to hear what I have to say. I want you to hear the feelings that I'm expressing, whatever they might be: joy, sadness, frustration, anger, right? It doesn't matter. What is universally true is that we all have that desire to be heard. And so I think the posture that we're talking about is one that is deeply honoring, as I said, of both the person who is speaking, the musicians, the poet, as well as to the one who has created that person and who has inspired the work that you are listening to. You're honoring both at the same time, in the same way that when you listen to a friend, you are honoring both the friend and the one who has given you that friend and who has created that friend and who is walking with that friend through whatever it is they need to talk about, right? And so there's just a receptivity and an intentionality there that I think is so valuable. It's not necessarily about a specific result. It's about the process of walking through it. As the listener, the end result of the one who is giving or doing the talking and the sharing will probably be different, right? They have a different result. They're looking to be heard in this. What the listener is looking for is to simply notice and be present. And it's through that process that we often end up hearing really, really meaningful things, right? Yeah. But we're not actively going after the thing. We're not like, I need you to tell me about this so that I can benefit. It's a very others-centered thing, right? It's and yet when we do this, when we focus outside of ourselves, this is what the Christian walk is, right? When we focus outside of ourselves on God and on others, we end up growing and forming ourselves. We are so enriched by that that it seems counterintuitive because right, our humanness wants us to focus on what can I get out of this? How can I create this impact for myself? When really it's this kind of servant posture that then enables us to be blessed through it. It's just like the last shall be first and the first shall be last, right? Same idea, just put in a musical listening context. Maybe that's too deep.
Our guest today is Dr. Anne van der Merwe, and we pause from this conversation to remind you of an app that could be very helpful for you in your process of listening and practice of listening. It's called A Simple Pause. It's available for a free download. It's a gift, really, to you from the people at A Simple Pause. You can find more information at asimplepause.org. That's their web address. Or you can just go to your app store, download the app, and start listening, start engaging with God in a different way, using music, using art, using things like a Visio Divina, where you can just sit and be contemplative for a little bit and wonder with God, how are you doing? How is your life with God? Where is God inviting you to take next steps of faith, steps of courage, steps into joy and delight? Life is about relationship with God, and we don't want you to miss it. So make sure you take some time to pause. All right, back to the conversation. It just reminds me that this journey of becoming formed more into the image of Christ for the sake of the world it really isn't a privatized thing. Just the way you were describing, there's something that the person who's being listened to will receive by being listened to well. There's also something that the listener is actually experiencing once they take the focus off of themselves. I'm here to see in the other the image of God. I'm here to see God. I'm here to experience God in this community, right? So here I am talking about community. I'd love for you to just even just nuance that a bit, just in terms of this reciprocal relationship of together with you. I'm growing more and more into the image of Christ. Does that make sense?
It does. And where my mind goes immediately as I'm listening to you talk about that is actually thinking about the connection between ourselves and the artists that we listen to. There is, as I said, because of technology, there is a physical distance that exists between us and artists, right? Most of the time. Yes, some of us thankfully get the opportunity to see people perform live, and it's great. I'm really excited about a concert I get to go to next week with my son. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And by all means, when you have the opportunity, go and see live music. It's a wonderful thing like nothing else.
Especially you two at the Sphere. Yes.
Yeah. And yet I think that what I am thinking about as we're having this conversation is that while listening to a recording doesn't replace that live music experience, we can still find an interpersonal connection within a digital world, right? We've all been challenged with this the last few years as to how do we make the most of that environment. And as somebody who's now teaching entirely in a digital environment, I can relate to that as well. And so while again, I am not in any way dismissing the importance of real human interaction in our lives, in the church, in our families, in musical contexts, in musical ways. But I think that again, there is an opportunity to see beyond the limitations and recognize what's there. And I think maybe a touch point for this is think about how many times you have heard someone talk about a musical artist and say how much their songs have meant to them, right? Maybe there's been even a particular song that, gosh, I was really struggling with this in my life, and this song just really helped me get through that period or help me deal with that issue and process these emotions that I was feeling, right? Somebody who walks into music like that is immediately connected to the person who is making it, right? Even if they've never met, they feel a connection, they experience some kind of connection. And if they do get a chance to meet that person in the flesh, as we would say, right? Their natural expression would be to share that with them and to say, like, I feel like I've known you because I have experienced your music in this way, and it has affected me, and I have heard it. It has had this impact on me in my life. And so I think there's also just it's an awareness that yes, there are limitations to that, but there are also still opportunities to engage within. And we can take advantage of that, again, by paying attention and having that posture of, I really want to listen to this artist and hear what they have to say, and read about them and listen to them if they have other, avenues of expression. There's a lot of artists that have podcasts or write books or have a website where they share other media, where they, share. This is actually especially true for the artists that are, I'll say, less well-known in the world, right? Because they want to share themselves with the world and they want to be heard, but they maybe are just starting out and they don't have a huge following. So you can find their representations of themselves through these digital environments.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm not sure if that's where you wanted to go with that, but that's where my brain hit.
Yeah.
And so I think there's such potential there. The other thing that comes to mind is connecting through community and through music. And creativity in general, I think. This is not something that's exclusive to music and musicians, but the idea of listening to one another, which again, everyone does in various kinds of situations, right? That translates even more when we're open to listening to and sharing ideas, sharing artwork, sharing things that we've made. Right? There's a level of intimacy that is crafted where we start to feel open to share those things with people, and that helps create community. And so I think the idea of our own creativity within the communities that we already have, nurturing that and fostering that through the idea of listening as not just a practical tool that we need to listen to one another, but that we have that openness and create a kind of community where people feel like they can share their full selves.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question here out of the blue, maybe. What kind of people are we becoming when we become active listeners?
I definitely think we are becoming other focused. It is, which is not to say that it cannot be a self-reflective process.
Okay.
I don't mean that at all, but I think it does invite us to a place where we are, if you think about it just on a mental processing level, if I am fully listening to something else, I'm turning down the dialogue in my own head. Now, as I listen, I may have thoughts that respond, that react, that reflect, right? Just as if we think about when we're reading a book, right? And we're reading through, we may have an emotional response, we may have a verbal response, we may have a written, we may want to write something down as we're doing that, but we're not on our own track. We're not reading the book and thinking about everything we have to do tomorrow or this other entire thing. In fact, if we do, and that does happen sometimes to me, at least when I'm reading, and then I have to go, oh wait, I read through that page, but I got to go back and read that again because my mind just went over here, right? So it is inherently an other-centered place to be. And I think in terms of a formative element, right, that is, that's where God can do the most, is where we are outside of ourselves. If we're so focused on ourselves, and sometimes we're going to be in places in life where that's where we are, because life is just really hard and it's hard for us to pull ourselves around to look at somebody else's challenges and situation. But putting ourselves into that space allows God, I think, to form us and continues to help us see how valuable that posture is and how much more restful it is than to be caught up in our own inner monologue all of the time. So I think that's definitely the first thing that comes to mind. I think the other thing is just it's an openness. There is a right, if we think about the common dialogues surrounding prayer, for instance, right? We describe prayer as a conversation, but a lot of times, most of us tend to talk, what do I need to say? And of course, we are supposed to talk to God. We are supposed to share our concerns, our cares, our praises, our all the things. but we're also, it's a conversation. It's not just let me unload on this and then, check off. It is also, let me hear, let me listen to what you have to say. And so there's intentionality in being open to what an artist has to say and to what God might have to say through that artist. I think, I mentioned that oftentimes we can find spiritual meaning in music that isn't necessarily written for that purpose. I think one of the kind of biggest misconceptions is that if we are Christian, then we are always needing to find explicitly Christian music, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And there may be times when that's entirely appropriate. But I have a friend who became a Christian, as an adult, which was not my experience. So I can't speak to that kind of situation myself. But she has told me on multiple occasions how when she first became a Christian and started following Jesus, that she was listening to the same music she had always listened to, and yet it spoke to her differently. She started noticing and hearing things in the lyrics, in the music itself, that were conveying spiritual truth and spiritual longing. And she hadn't heard it that way before because she wasn't in the place to do that. She wasn't, to use that word, like she wasn't open to that. But once she was open to it, it was like, oh, well, that's interesting. It's kind of, from a visual standpoint, we talk about seeing the fingerprints of God in all these different things that we encounter in our daily lives. And the same is true for the listening. It's this openness to hearing what is out there. It's just a different place to be.
Yeah. Yes, I just had this experience yesterday. I was at a retreat, and they gave us some time in the afternoon to reflect on, what they called the Moses principle. And basically, I love, drawing so much wonderful depth and, ideas for transformation from the story of Moses. But this was really interesting. It was talking about the rod that Moses had in his hand that God asked him to throw down on the ground. And so this idea of like, well, what's in our hand and what do we need to throw down or lay down? And what does it feel like when it turns on you and begins to hiss? What's that thing that you hold on to that's so much a part of your identity? So there's a lot of deep questions in this exercise. And what it reminded me of was not someone new, but someone who was very formative, probably in my high school years, an artist by the name of Ken Miedema. Does that name ring a bell at all?
It does not, no.
Yeah. So my understanding, I'd have to look this up to confirm it. I'm pretty sure though, he was a very talented songwriter who played piano and was also blind. And he wrote a song that I remembered when I went to go be alone with God, called Moses. And it's an 8-minute long song. And it's just him playing the piano and singing. And he tells the story of, Moses coming to the bush. And there's many elements to the song. It's like, it just keeps veering into different like textures and styles. But about the last 2.5 minutes of the song is when God says to put this rod down on the ground and then to pick it up, as a snake. And Moses is like, God, you must not have been around here very long. Don't you know we don't pick up, snakes by the tail? And then everything in the music shifts and it gets quieter and it gets super simple, like one note and then two dissonant notes next to each other, right? And then it shifts from that into this very comforting chord progression that, like, I was surprised. Here's why I'm saying all this. I was surprised as I was listening to this song that I remembered from way, way back when, maybe even junior high years. When it got to that simple part at the end where it was like, let's draw all this to a close. Hey, Moses, don't you know that when you lay down your rod, it becomes It becomes the rod of God. And what does that mean? And then the question turns to the listener. So what do you have in your hand, right? And I'm listening to this and I begin to bawl. I'm all by myself, nobody can see me. And it was everything. It wasn't just the fact that I was supposed to be having that, asking God those very questions, but it was very much the music. It was the form. It was the way the thing shifted from noisy and clamorous to invitational. And I had to keep listening to it over and over again. And I kept getting that same spot and I would cry. So it evokes listening this way. Yeah, I could have listened to 8 different songs, but I chose to listen to one 8-minute long song 8 times, right? So, but music is this mysterious gift, this artistry, this beauty, this wonder of God for us, for our souls to find connection to God, and oftentimes to others as well, but certainly to ourselves. Certainly to pay attention to what is that about, God? Why is it in that moment that's the reaction that my body that has been keeping the score is no longer able to contain itself anymore. I am noticing that this is moving me. There's something in here, God, I should be paying attention to. All right, so that's all just to kind of say here at the close. That's why this conversation matters. Because God, who loves us, is curating even the story of our lives and weaving together the parts of our lives, the brokenness, the joy, the pain, everything, all the parts of our lives, the loneliness, the sense of community, our own health, our own fears, our own sense of failure, our own desires. He's curating all those parts of our lives because God loves us and is not leaving us alone on this spinning world. God is with us, and we're getting to encounter and be with God who loves us. And to do that, we've got to pay attention. How would you sum this up?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And I think as I'm listening to you thinking about God as the curator of our lives, it makes me think of some words from Makoto Fujimura, who's a visual artist, but whose book Art and Faith is really, really impacted me because of how it speaks of God's creativity. And he as being the only true artist. And he's the one who is crafting these things together. And as I listen to you talk about that specific listening experience, right? Why did that song come to your mind at that particular moment? I mean, yes, there's a logical connection. You were talking about Moses and then you'd heard this before and that, but yet God had a hand in creating all of those connection points, right? He's weaving that together. He is the one who is using the artist, using the music that artist created to express something to you that's difficult to put into words entirely. But this is the beauty of God, is that as the creator that he is, he creates order out of chaos, and the boundaries between word and vision and hearing and sound, these things all start to merge together for him, right? The imagery of the creation story in Genesis, such that, and then echoed in the first chapter of John, right? The word becomes the image, and the image becomes the word, right? There's this fluidity between what we hear and what we see that I think God is able to craft in our lives, as you say, if we pay attention. So just as we might say, we need to pay attention to the things that God puts in our lives to see, the same is true for the sounds that we hear, whether that's specifically songs, Again, that's been our focus here today. But that idea of tying and linking things together, that's God at work. That is how God creates order out of chaos and brings things together and curates our lives and curates people and art that shape us. And he uses those things. Those are his creative tools to be able to do that for us because he loves us.
Yeah. Would you end our time by just praying for our listeners? And I believe that even God can use this technology we're using to record this and for people to listen to it and to even work God's ways over the course of time. Like as you're praying now, I believe that this prayer may be able to be received and to have impact as some listener is listening to this later at another time. And so would you just pray for our listeners to be able to really, truly listen well to God and to notice God's love in all of that?
It would be a joy. Father, you are the greatest listener. You have been listening to us from the beginning. And we just pray, Lord, that you would continue to invite us to listen to all that you have to say and all the different ways through which you speak. We pray that you would draw us in and help us to pay attention, to not just hear, but to soak it in. Allow the things that we hear, the music and the words, to soak into our souls, to feed us in ways that only you can, to speak to us in ways that only you can. I pray, Lord, that you would use the words that I am speaking, that Adam has spoken, that so many artists at so many times and places that we can hear. Pray that you would use all of that, Lord, and the things that are still yet to come to speak your word into the lives of individual people, to transform them, and to invite them to know you more, to understand themselves, and to just rest and walk with you. All this we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you. I'm so grateful for you, and I know our listeners are as well.
This was a joy and a pleasure and so much fun.
Would you come back and do this again sometime?
Absolutely.
I trust that as you're listening to God, you'll be noticing other themes and things that are rising to the surface that are really drawing your attention, and you're so articulate at anything you discuss. So I look forward to the email I'll get one day where you're like, I got something. Let's do this. Okay. Or I will also listen too. I promise I will. But thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Adam. I really enjoy the opportunity to share, and I'm just always grateful for you and for what you're doing in the world.
Cool. Thank you, Anne. All right. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
As always, thank you so much for listening. Today, we've got some exciting guests coming for you. Steve Macchia, Stephen Smith, and many, many more. We'd love for you to share this, get word out about this podcast to those in your circle of influence. Until next time, grace and peace, everyone.